So what we'll talk about today for the next 45 to 50 minutes per se is on basically this ongoing Greek debt crisis and the impact it has both in Greece as well as otherwise. And then I'll kind of probably have about, hopefully in the last 10 odd minutes, to kind of take your questions and see if I can, how can I address them and how best can I address them. Very quickly, to kind of give you an introduction of myself, like in 30 seconds. My name is Shankarshan Basu, and I teach finance at IIM Bangalore. Have been in IIMB now for about 13 years and work in the space of quantitative finance and a lot of these things. And I have a fair amount of interest in debt problems and debt and all that. So let's get started. So what are we going to talk about? We are going to pretty much talk about these things. We are going to talk about broadly the timeline of the crisis. So I mean, I'll give you an indication as to how the crisis developed, and that kind of will give you an indication towards the later part as what could have been potentially done to, if not completely avoid the crisis, but at least significantly reduce the impact of the crisis, which itself would have been a huge benefit. The next part, let's talk about some of the factors that kind of affect the crisis, or the factors that have contributed to the crisis. And then we'll move into the effects that this crisis has, both economically, which is the prime focus, but also there are larger amount of social implications or social questions that effects that have been had. And at some level it is very difficult to aggregate between the social and the economic effects, because the overall political economy of a country or any political economy is dependent on the social factors as well. And then finally we'll try and talk about some of the the $1 billion question: who's next, and then what are the choices that Greece has. Let me put a caveat in there to start with. Obviously, we do not have any answer to saying who's next, and how does Greece get out of this problem. I think if I did have the answer, then I would be sure to be getting Nobel Prize this year. Since I don't know it, the Nobel Prize is, I'm not going to know, and therefore I'm not getting the Nobel Prize. But jokes apart, I think there is no one answer. Each problem has, each solution or each alternate has its own implications and our own structure. And that's what we kind of highlight a few of them. So let me talk about a little bit. Let me give you a little bit of the background of the country, just to kind of get the context set. It's a developed country, as you can see. It's not a huge. It's not a very. It's a populous country by European standards, but by our standards, it's not really a huge population. Population of about 11 million, which is probably the population of Bombay, or slightly less than that. But on PPP basis, and in terms of economic parameters, on PPP basis, which is purchasing power parity basis, GDP is about $265 billion, which is about a fourth, slightly less, maybe a third, about 20% of India's GDP. Now, this is the interesting thing. For a zone and for an economy, for a part of being an economy which has been in recession, it has still had about 3.9% growth in the last year. And over the last 5 years, the compounded annual growth rate, the CAGR, has been at about 5%, 5.2%, about 5%. And then this makes things even more interesting, or even more baffling at some point. Then how come a country which is growing at about 4%, grew at 4% last year, has a CAGR of about 5%, really get into the kind of mess that it has got into, and to the extent, as most of you may have read, and people have said, surrendered significant amount of their sovereignty. Well, it's not to the European Union and to the traders. You would have to realize and understand that surrendering sovereignty today does not mean like in the 1700s, where a foreign power actually came and occupied and ruled your country. Today, surrendering of sovereignty, of economic sovereignty, So Greece today, I mean, if all the proposals go through, there are Greece will not have their own right to decide of things, and that's a huge implication of the whole process. And we will come to more of that as we go along. Per capita income isn't too bad. It's about $24,000 a year, which is not a very high number, but it's not too bad in that region. What is really stark and what I think has kind of hit them very badly is that unemployment levels are at about 30%, 27%. So 25% of the country is unemployed. And incidentally, as you will see later, this number is significantly reduced because of the entire population that you take. If you look at within the youth, within the workable age, the unemployment numbers are much higher. Within the youth category or within the young adult category who are just about eligible for jobs, the unemployment rate has shot up to somewhere about 50%. And that is where the biggest challenge is. Inflation, actually the country is in a deflationary scenario. The inflation is about minus 1%, which is not a very good idea, but I think a lot of the deflationary effect is an outcome of the current crisis, and therefore people are really not bothered about saving and then the long-term investments and all that, and hence the deflationary effect is kind of coming. And also, though there is a large number of Greeks Greeks who remain outside the country, the FDI inflow, the foreign direct investment inflow into the country has been a measly, 2.6 billion. So it's just about 1% of their GDP, which they're getting as foreign funds, which is a very small amount, as you realize. So where does all of this start from? Interestingly, as you can see that Greece has had a history of financial trouble. It is not new. So to the Greeks, financial trouble is probably something which is not new. The first one happened way back in 4th century BC. And, for the last 90 odd years. So in a sense, modern day Greece came about post the First World War, when part of the, the Byzantine Empire, part of the Ottoman Empire was kind of put together, and the modern day Greece, as a political unit of Greece was formed sometime in the post of First World War. And in the last 90 years, or since the formation of Greece in the last 90 years, about half the time there has been some kind of a financial crisis or other. It's not blown up to this proportions because in some sense in the region between the First and the Second World War, the Second World War came in and then things became different. Post the Second World War, there was the Marshall Plan that worked in Europe, which gave them money, and therefore they kind of averted the kind of crisis that we see today. Another very important reason was it could avert the crisis, which now they can't, or they couldn't work because they had the independence of the currency. So they had the drachma. The Greek currency was called drachma. The drachma could kind of, obviously the drachma could be reduced in value, devalued, therefore they kind of managed that. But today they can't even devalue the euro because the euro is not controlled by Greece alone, it's controlled by every other European member state in the same proportion, and maybe some states have a little more power in that than the others. So I think the combination of this created a real challenge for Greece, Greeks who over the years have had a history of financial crisis, but this time the crisis was probably something completely different which they had not underestimated. This is the latest one. And in a sense, as I said, every time there's been a crisis, Greece has kind of, somebody or the other has kind of come and bailed Greece out in some format or the other. The latest one, as you can see out there in the picture, the Greek Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras and the German Chancellor Merkel, and as recently as Wednesday or Thursday of this week, Greece will again get bailed out. The bailout amount being $96 billion as the latest thing. But what has happened? I mean, and I'll talk about a little more on that later. This was what was finally hammered out of the negotiation over the last weekend, and some of you would have read about the all-night negotiations that went on. However, the conditions on that were the Greek Parliament had to approve a huge number of budgetary cuts and a lot of reform process had to be put in place or had to be accepted. By Wednesday, the 15th of July, the Greek government, the Greek Parliament, pretty much with its back to the wall, has approved those. It still does not automatically make it available to them, but now it's probably a matter of formality because most of the other European countries, the countries which are going to be putting together this money, will now have to ratify it in their parliaments before the money is available. But there is an intent, and given that the conditions have been set by the European powers, it is more of a matter of time and more of a formality for that to kind of happen. The kind of conditions that have been put in this latest bailout proposal is to say the least, is stifling and humiliating for Greece. However, the Greeks were themselves to blame for it because, as we'll see, there have been repeated bailouts, and in each of these bailouts, the Greeks were supposed to deliver on certain things. However, in none of these cases, the Greeks have delivered. So every time they've kind of gone back saying, "Oh, we have not, we begin run out of money, but we've not delivered on any of." So they have not taken any responsibility of delivering on the previous things, but they've kind of just gone back and asked money. And I think it's also become a case of an unfortunate case of that, crying wolf, that they've done it so many times that the lenders, particularly led by Germany and to some extent France, but more led by Germany, has kind of lost its patience and therefore have told Greece that there's really nothing. Obviously, the kind of powers that the Greek government will have to give up tantamounts to surrendering part of the sovereign duties and sovereign rights, and hence this is kind of, the Twitter has kind of or the Twitterity has kind of taken it as under this hashtag of this is a coup, and saying this is a kind of a silent coup against the against not the Greek government but the Greek people at large. So how did Greece get there? And what happened? Let's look at the story in a simple thing. Greece joined the EU in 1981, so and adopted Euro in time to be among the first wave of countries. So in 2001, they adopted the Euro, and they were they were among the first set of countries, along with Germany, Netherlands, France, who had from 1st January 2002 the Euro banknotes. Now, the original countries who came into the Eurozone or the Euro currency were actually ready to do it by as early as 1998. So for the first 3 years, 99, 2000, 2001, Euro worked on a fixed exchange rate basis, but not on a currency. They didn't have their own currencies. Their own currencies came about in 2002, and to that extent, Greece was not among the first set of countries to join the European Monetary European Monetary Union, but they were among the people who joined well in time for them to be the first set of countries who would also have Euro notes and Euro banknotes and Euro currency available to them. And as you can see, on 1st January 1999, this was the launch of the Euro as a single currency. The Euro as a single physical currency came about on 1st January 2002, and for the first 3 years, 99, 2001, the common exchange rates were set, and therefore, but they still didn't have a fixed currency of their own. Now coming back to the Greek debt, what happened? The Greek debt crisis effectively started in late 2009, and in a sense, it was the first of the 5 sovereign debt crises that hit the zone and then have subsequently been referred to collectively as the European debt crisis. So you had this story of the pigs, Portugal, Ireland, Iceland, Greece and Spain, and of which Iceland had defaulted, was the first country to default, and then the whole economic revival happened, and today it's a very booming economy. But at that time, these were the 5 countries that the first 5 economies which were on the verge of default, and now as we speak, two of them have. Yes, one of them has come back, but that was what led to the formation of the acronym FIG. In Greece, the triggers for this crisis was primarily the turmoil of the recession and a huge amount of structural weakness in the Greek economy. And because of the lack of real action on the ground, there was a sudden crisis in the confidence of the lenders, particularly because Greece itself had its own problems, but on top of that you had the scenario that Iceland had defaulted, so the contagion effect kind of hit Greece, and there was a huge loss of confidence among the lenders, and therefore Greece did not really have money to kind of pay. One of the other reasons that happened, and the loss of confidence was because of this. In late 2009, there were fears that came about that Greece would not be able to meet its debt obligations. Greece did not meet its debt obligations, but that happened 6 years later because of the bailouts that happened in between. But what was the trigger point? The trigger point was that they figured out that all these international lenders and all these private lenders figured out that the data that Greek government had been out on their levels, debt levels and deficits and all were actually all misreported. And to put it in a more stronger term, they were actually fudged. And then once the new data came out, there was a huge stark difference between the new data set and the old data, and the data that was published. And that led to an additional loss of confidence among the people. And you can look at this graph, and this was indicated by the widening of the bond spreads and the cost of risk, cost of insurance on the default on the CDS. And then you can see out here, you can see this is the Greece. This is I don't know what happened. This is the Greek default. This is the Greek bonds spread, and this is the other countries. So, and if you look at the red one, the red one is UK, which was, if we take that as a baseline, look at the level to which the Greek spread had kind of moved up to, and that is huge. So and then the larger the spread, the larger is the cost, so the less likelihood is, or the larger is the cost of insurance, and there were less likelihood of people to kind of invest in such bonds. In 2012, the government of Greece had the largest sovereign debt default in history. Because of the bailout, so they were staring at the largest ever sovereign debt default that had happened. And then obviously, everybody else was equally worried because there was a huge contagion effect that could kind of come in. And finally, on June 30, 2015, this is recent news. All of you know, Greece became the first developed country to fail to make an IMF loan repayment. So they became the first developed country to actually default on an IMF loan. Having said that, has nobody defaulted on IMF loans? The answer is yes, countries have defaulted on IMF loans. But they have typically been what IMF classifies them as either developing countries or less developed, underdeveloped countries. So you've had countries in Africa, you've had countries in Latin America, and who have kind of defaulted on debt. But for a developed country to default, this was the first time that it happened. In fact, most developing countries don't default. India, which is a developing country, has never defaulted on any international debt obligations that it has, be it to IMF, be it to World Bank, be it to any other lender source. What you see on the right hand side is essentially of the $321 billion €321 billion of Greek debt that exists. That's approximately a little more than about close to 0.9. So divided by 0.9, so this is about close to $370 billion. You see what the proportion is, and as you can see, the Germans hold about close to 1/6 of the entire debt, 63.5 billion euros of debt of the whole thing. IMF comes second from at about 31.9. The bilateral loans add up to 52.9, but they are kind of split across a number of Eurozone states, and so there's no one country. So the largest one is obviously The largest share comes from from Germany, and then from IMF. And then the rest of it kind of adds up in that fashion. Greece obviously has not been helped by the fact that while they had fudged data and all that, they've been in the last 7 years they've been hit by three distinct recessionary periods. 2007, the last 2 quarters, the second half of 2007 was a recession. The economy revived a little bit, basically came out of recession, not boomed, but came out of recession. Then when the quarter 2 of 2008, it hit a recession once again, and then so there was a blip in the interim period where it had come out of recession, but it went back into recession for the next 3 quarters, and then again the same thing, a marginal blip of coming out for a quarter or two, and then from 2009, the third quarter of 2009 till at present time, the country is under recession. And obviously, therefore, the productivity, the ability to generate cash or capital for the country significantly suffers. This is how the debt to GDP ratio has increased. So from 2009 to 2012, in the 2 years time, debt to GDP ratio has increased by approximately 40%. It's slightly less than 40%, but approximately 40%. And 146% is huge. Having said that 146% is huge, please remember this is also contextual. There are countries which have had way more than 140% debt to GDP ratio. But then there have been reasons, there have been other mechanisms to kind of balance that up and to kind of hold that up. So for example, I'll give you one classic example. At the end of the Second World War, the United Kingdom had a debt of something like 400% of their GDP. But remember, a lot of this debt was piled up due to the Second World War, or what was called as wartime expenses, and also there was the Marshall Plan of the United States that was brought in towards the redevelopment of Europe, and hence, given the productivity increase and all that the Britons managed, even at 400% of GDP being the debt, they kind of managed to pull it up and take care of that. Obviously, once the defaults happened and the default started looking like real possibility, all the rating agencies, whether it's Fitch, Moody's, S&P's, everybody responded by downgrading Greek government debt to junk bond status, which is below investment grade, and then as the risk of sovereign default increased. What this also meant was that this made access to private markets very, very difficult for the Greek government, and therefore they could not even if they wanted to borrow, they did not have really access to borrowing in the market. And as I was saying, this also meant that the yields responded by, obviously the yields will respond by rising into very high levels, essentially as I have put uncharted territories, unsustainable territories, and therefore the private capital market which exists worldwide became inaccessible to Greece as a source of funding, further making it dependent on sources of funding from various other governments who would extract their pound of flesh. What happened? This is what the story is there. The first part of the story. In the first bailout, there are three sets of players who were involved in the first bailout. The European Central Bank, the International Monetary Fund, so the ECB, the IMF, and the European Commission, the EC. And together at that point, they were and even today, they were called, and they're still called the Troika. So essentially, I had a troika of these three entities or three players who were then kind of running the thing, and decided to give a bailout of 110 million euros to 100 billion euros to Greece. The bailout was not free, and this bailout was supposed to run between May 2010 to June 2013. Over a 3-year period, they were supposed to get 110 billion euro. But as a part of that, they were also supposed to kind of, deliver some results. The results of the deliver were also essentially implementation of austerity measures, pension reforms, privatization of government assets, structural reforms, and all that kind of thing. However, the government was never serious about implementing any of those reforms, and the worsening recession, coupled with this inactivity or indifference of the government of the Greek government to implement the bailout, meant that very soon that money did not really suffice, and by 2011 an additional bailout was required. An additional bailout of about 130 billion euro was required, and this included an amount of about 48 billion euros, which was specifically earmarked towards recapitalizing the Greek banks. Remember, the Greek banks were all, because obviously with this kind of a cash outflow, the Greek banks were at severe threat of being wiped out. At the same time, the second thing was all the private creditors holding Greek bonds were required to were forced into signing or accepting a deal that extended their maturity. So basically their maturity periods were extended, so the immediate payout by the Greek government was kind of reduced. The possibility of immediate payout by the Greek government was kind of reduced. They had to accept extended maturities. Even though the bond covenant might have said, but they were kind of required to take lower interest rates, charge lower interest rates, and face up to 3.5% haircut or loss in face value. So if they had given a 100 euro bond, they were basically saying that not only would they get lower maturities and extended maturities and lower interest rates, they would only get 46.5% of the cash back. The rest was written off as a part of the dismissed by the second bailout was kind of ratified by all the parties in February 2012, and in effect it extended the first program, thereby getting $240 million, 240 billion euros as a bailout package. And this amount had to be transferred in regular tranches throughout the period of May 2010 to December 2014. In December 2012, Greece was again in problems. The recession hadn't helped, and they had really not implemented any of the conditions of the bailout program. So a further 8.2 billion euros were transferred during the period January 2015 to March 2016 as an additional payout. And this is where effectively the last of the bailouts happened. There was some silver lining for Greece, at least in a small period, and in both in 2013 and 2014, as you saw earlier when I was giving you the recession period, in some small periods, there was a decline of the unemployment rate and return of positive economic growth. This kind of helped the Greek government of Greece to kind of re-access the capital markets, the private capital markets per se. To that extent it helped Greece. But the problem that happened was that obviously did not include any of its or did not do any of its reform measures, and therefore very soon that would also dry up, as we see now. End of 2014, a fourth wave of recession hit Europe and Greece in particular, and Greece is worst affected simply because did not implement any of the structural reforms required to kind of cover themselves. What do the Greeks do, or what do the Greeks kind of do in that process? The Greek parliament, the Greek political system calls a snap election in December 2014. Between 1980 and 2014, the Greeks were ruled. There were two major political parties that kind of controlled the Greek parliament. There was the party called PASOK, and there was the New Democratic Front or something like that. They kind of won it. They were both right of center parties. However, in 2014, as a reaction to the austerity measures, only part of which was ever kind of implemented, the Greeks elected a party led by called Syriza, which was headed by Alexis Tsipras as the party in power. Alexis Tsipras came to power on the condition that he would take Greece out of the the conditions that the lenders had put together, and that he would kind of basically throw away the bailout pack, the conditions of the bailout, but he obviously needed the money. The Greek people, and in a sense, this was nothing but political grandstanding, because the Greek people kind of probably echoed or accepted that, and kind of put together a scenario by saying, I'm sorry, put together a scenario where they kind of elected him, but probably with disastrous consequences, as we will see. Now, post the election, they got a 4-month technical extension of the bailout program attached to the last round. We negotiated with the Greek government and it was supposed to be renegotiated before the end of April 2014, so that the review and the final transfer could be completed before the end of 2015. The Greeks started negotiating, but by the end of May, there was no deal. There was still no deal, and the negotiations were still pending. Negotiations were going on, but the negotiation deal was still pending. And then suddenly on the 26th of June 2015, the Greek government pulled off or broke away from their kind of walked out of the negotiations, and then diverting from their prior agreement to they had in a sense committed to continue negotiating until a mutually acceptable compromise could be presented. But they kind of there was no compromise, and they kind of walked out of the meeting, walked out of the negotiations without a deal. Result, what they did in that process was, the Greek Prime Minister, after calling off the negotiations, immediately went live on national television and announced a referendum on the 5th of July. And the referendum, there was a huge question, but the fundamental referendum question that was to be addressed was, would the Greeks approve or reject the preliminary negotiation result for a new set of updated terms? So did the Greeks agree to this bailout conditions, or should the bailout conditions be taken out? The government actively voted and actively and the government, before I go to the next slide, the government actually actively campaigned for a rejection, or what they call the no vote, a rejection of the EU terms and the ability to, and basically they were saying, give us money, but we will not agree to any conditions. This is what the government actively proposed. Obviously, it is very clear that the lenders would not have any of it, and this led panic to set in. The Greeks started pulling out money from the banks and ATMs as they felt there would be capital controls invoked, and therefore they wanted to kind of prevent their liquidity loss. Greek banks were under severe stress and they were running dangerously low on capital, and then they had to be shut down, and then the Greek government had to impose conditions of the amount of money that could be withdrawn by any account holder on a given day, and it had varied between 45 euros to 60 euros and back to 45. So that is the maximum that you could withdraw. It didn't matter whether you went to the bank. The banks were closed, so you couldn't withdraw from the bank. But if you went to an ATM, the maximum withdrawal limit, which was probably much higher for a number of them, was kind of brought down to only approximately 60 euros per day. The results of the Greek election referendum were out on the 5th of July, and not surprisingly, an overwhelming 61% of the electorate, not of the electorate, actually only 62% of 62.5% of the people voted, and of that an overwhelming 61% said no. We do not want controls. We do not want to be controlled or governed or dictated to by the EU. And only 39% agreed to kind of continue the conditions that were laid down. And as you can see on the left hand side, these were the kind of propaganda posters and all that the government actively engaged in. So no to the Troika tyranny. Troika out here referred to, as I said, the Troika of European Union, European Commission and the IMF. And they obviously wanted the governments to scrap the debt to serve the people. But really they did not have an alternate plan in place. Obviously what that meant was, and with the Greek the verge of default, the Greek government really didn't have a choice. They went back to renegotiate. They had to go back to renegotiate because there was really no money that the Greece had left with. The Greece had money for probably only a few days left. And now it finally landed up accepting all the terms of the European Commission and the European Union led consortium, and that is where it is kind of now there. The government has accepted all of it. It has been ratified by, as I said to start with, it has been ratified by Greece. Now it has to be ratified by the other European countries, other members of the EU. Essentially, it has to be ratified by the other European countries. So that is where the crisis is. Now, what has happened in terms of the crisis? Where did the crisis come from? Though I did say that there is crisis, but what are the sources of the crisis? The first source of the crisis is essentially financial profligacy of successive governments. It's unfair in a sense to blame any one government. It is government after government over the last 40 years or 35 years, or probably even more, that they have kind of spent way beyond their means. So they spent way more than what they could earn. And like all of us, we can't land up continuing to spend beyond our means. Greece will now face the problem of that. One of the additional problems that Greece has, typically countries can afford to spend more than what they earn because they have the right to print money. But the ability of Greece to print money is also severely constrained because of the EU setup, there is only a certain amount of money that you can that can be printed. And this is exactly what I said. This is an obvious recipe for disaster. As you can see, your expenses were kind of way more than the revenue that came in. And if you look at the gap, and this was the net borrowing that they had to do, at no point has this gap become negative, which means they have always been having incremental borrowing. So while the borrowing was peaked at about in 2009 period, where the borrowing peaked at about 36 billion euros, even in 2014 the gap is 5 billion. Now, but it's not, the gap may have narrowed, but please realize that this amount has not been paid back. So even if you start from here, so if you come to here, the national borrowing in the sense is 36 plus 24. That's 60, 20, 80, 92, 102. So from 2009 to today to 2014, the Greek government nationally had to borrow another 102 billion euros, and I'm not accounting for the previous part. That will only add up. So this is additional. So it's a cumulative borrowing effect that is hitting Greece in a sense. The Greek government, as long as it could manage, did not want to avoid or did not want to kind of take any drastic measures which would have implications. Greece was faced with low productivity, high cost of labor, and therefore eroding competitiveness. And Greece, as you'll see in the later slide, is one of the most corrupt countries in Europe and definitely across the world. Rampant tax evasion. So there was, and that is what led to huge expenses, which was not controlled, low revenue generation. And if you still wanted to continue the party to carry on, what is your source? Go and borrow. So I borrow money to party. But obviously at some point this had to stop, and that is what is now kind of coming in. One of the other problems that Greece faced, and that's the kind of, in hindsight, was admission into the Eurozone in January 2011. Because once they got admitted into the Eurozone, they made it more easier for the government to borrow and hence fund the growth. Because the government would then have access to the European market, and they were borrowing collectively as a European entity. So basically the ability of the government to borrow became easier. The government continued to borrow and fund and continue funding this growth. But very soon the bonds, the government started kind of, the Greek bond spread started to kind of with respect to the rest of the European zone thing. So what you can see is that the orange line is essentially the Euro average bond spread, whereas the blue line is the Greek thing. And if you look at in 2009 when the crisis happened, the initial part of the 2009 period, it was still kind of coupled up or linked up to that. But somewhere around towards the end, somewhere around October, November onwards, you see the Greek bond rate, the Greek bond spread starts to move on an independent trajectory of its own. It doesn't care where it happens, and it becomes wider. So that makes it that much more difficult for Greeks to raise funding. Obviously, as I just said earlier, the growth came at a very steep price in the form of rising deficits and an ever increasing debt load, which then went to hit them. Interestingly, Greece also had exceptions at the time of entry. They were supposed to have addressed some of these issues, but they never did it, though they had committed to doing it. So, in terms of to maintain the European Union and the European Common Market, the Euro, I would say, there's something called the Stability and Growth Pact of the EU, and it already exceeded the limits mandated. The understanding was that they would kind of bring it down to within the limits, which they never did. Because if you look at it in 2000, they, in fact, on the contrary, they actually increased. Because if you look at it, in the permissible debt to GDP ratio was only 60%, but Greece at that time at 103%. Today it's about 140, 150%. The fiscal deficit as a proportion of GDP, the permissible limit was only 3%. They were already at 3.7% and it's only gone up since then. What crisis is, the Greek government also kind of analyzed what were the reasons, and they came up with very, very similar reasons. Growth rates, they funded growth rates, they funded growth, but they funded growth at the cost of deficit and the government debt level. So they kind of had huge deficits and huge debt, which obviously meant they were, which got them money and therefore funded growth. The economy grew, but as I was saying to start with, the economy definitely grew, but at what cost, and hence the deficit and the debt level kind of became one of the biggest crises. So had Greece not wanted to grow at that rate, they wouldn't have had to borrow or fund at that rate, and they would probably have been safer. Inability of the successive governments to comply with budgetary requirements and all, and the essential fiscal profligacy, as I said, was another primary reason, according to the government also, for the crisis. And I think the last point is also equally important, and it's just not about statistical credibility. While the government mentioned and talked about statistical credibility, I would tend to put it as in a larger context as simply as credibility by itself. And what I mean by that is essentially the fact that they had misreported data and they had gone back on every single of their commitments was obviously hitting them negatively. Now, these are some of the other factors that affected the Greek crisis. Interestingly, between 1960 and 1970, for 13 years, they had surpluses, but they never capitalized on it. And since 1974, so for the last 40 years, they have had budget deficits. For the first 6 years, life was simple for them because their deficits were below 3% of GDP, which was manageable. But since 1981, so for the last 35 or 33 years, or 32 years, their budget deficits have been way above the 3% of GDP norm, which has been the European norm. And this has kind of affected the crisis significantly. Greece has a current account trade balance and trade deficit, and that averaged about 9.1% of GDP over the first 10 years of this century. Between 2000 and 2011, the trade deficit averaged around 9.1% of GDP. GDP at about $265 billion. So the current account trade deficit was trading at about $25 billion. For a country with 11 million people, GDP of only $256 billion, a deficit of $26 billion is huge. Tax evasion and corruption is in some sense inherent and entrenched in the Greek system. In 2010, there have been studies which have said that just the tax evasion ensured the Greek government lost an amount well over 120 billion, and approximately that's about 8% of their GDP. So they had 9% trade deficit, they were losing money to tax evasion at the rate of about 8% of their GDP. Now if you just added that together, you'll see your GDP itself goes up by another $50 billion approximately. And it is definitely, it has been accepted uniformly that it is among the most countries. It is the most corrupt country in the EU. One other very important thing hit the Greek economy very badly, and I think that the 1973 condition is kind of the 1973 period where we said that the first set of deficits started coming in is actually very, very important and relevant in this context. And that is because Greek economy has fundamentally over the years been driven by two things: the shipping industry, the tourism industry. The tourism industry remained, but the tourism is not. I mean, tourism is big, but it's not really a huge. I mean, not as huge as you can think of the shipping industry. For centuries, and definitely for most part of this century, Greeks have had a very strong shipping industry. The Onassis of the world, Alexander Onassis and the rest of it was there. The two problems are there. Two problems happened with the shipping industry, which was not in Greece's control, but definitely hit Greece very, very badly. One was the oil shock of 1973. Ships are fuel guzzlers. Ships are, and these are not small ships. We're talking about large container ships and cargo ships, cargo transport. Ships are oil guzzlers. Oil crisis of 1973 meant that the cost of shipping went up significantly. Security in the high seas obviously the cost of security has increased significantly. That has also led to a negative effect on the shipping. The other thing that really has kind of metamorphed the whole shipping or transport industry is the fact of the airline industry. The air freight has become far more economical, and the time saved has kind of ensured that people have moved away from the shipping industry to the air freight. Some of the shipping has also, and also the Greeks did not innovate. So a lot of the Greek shipping that could have been done today, for example, something that cannot still be transferred by air in that sense, oil. But today the largest oil tankers and oil refineries, the floating oil refineries, have been innovated and built by South Korea. And that market has also been taken away from Greece by South Korea over the years. And therefore the shipping industry has collapsed. One of the pillars of their economy has collapsed, and that led to the problem even further. As you can see out here, these are the parameters of the Greek. This is all about the government, Greece, and you have the total external debt, the general government deficit debt, and all of it. The central government debt, gross central government debt, and all. If you look at all parameters, over from 1980 onwards, it was till about the mid 90s, it was kind of stable, low, and then in the last 20 years, it shot up, as you can see on this part of the graph. The same thing in the same period, if I look at it, the Greek debt compared to the average Eurozone debt, it's kind of, initially it was lower, as you can see, for the first few years. 1982-83, it was kind of break-even point, and then it started moving up. It remained reasonably constant for about 15 years, but somewhere around 2006-2007, it suddenly shot up and then started moving on its own. The same thing out here. This is the unemployment rates in Greece. The blue line on top is the employment, but that you look at as on the left axis, based on this, and then the red line is the unemployed amount. So if you look at it, this is in 1974. Between 1974 and now, the unemployment numbers have gone up, and the employed numbers have significantly come down. The black and the blue lines are this is the unemployment rate, which has kind of started increasing, peaked at somewhere about 28% and now come down to about 26%. And the green one is the inactive people who are there. Inactive people remain reasonably constant, but this is the kind of chart that we see. Okay, now let's quickly talk about a little bit of the thing. I know I'm running a bit short on time, so I'll try to quickly look at it. In 2011, the GDP was positive, but there was a decline in 2011, sorry, not last year. In 2011, the GDP declined by 6.9%. And the industrial output ended up 30% lower, 28.4% lower than 6 years back in 2005. Huge impact, huge blow on the economy. So if you look at this, the GDP from $242 billion in 2014 came down to $179 billion. This is how it is kind of dropped in, and 26% drop that has happened. The per capita GDP also has come down over that period, a 24% decline. These are facts. 2011, about 111,000 Greek companies based out of Greece went bankrupt, and that was about 27% higher than the corresponding number in 2010. It's not just higher, it's about, 1 in 3 companies in Greece was defaulting more than in the previous year. Employment scenario, you can actually, and this is what I was saying, the overall in September in 2008, the unemployment rate was only, overall unemployment rate was only 7.5%. The youth unemployment rate was about 22%. In 4 years, that moved up to 23% and 55%. So the youth unemployment rate has gone up to as high as 55%. And these are the people who are coming into the system looking and should be looking for jobs. And there, more than half the people are not getting jobs per se. Currently, this is where it stands. The highest debt to GDP ratio is Japan. The second highest is Nigeria. Greece is at about 177% or 317 billion euros is what the thing is. But it is not just this. So the debt to GDP ratio is higher in Japan. But why is Japan not defaulting? Please realize that they had about 256 billion euros of public debt in 2011. That's come down a little bit, but still that. And it came down, but they have not really delivered on any of these promises. They have not delivered on any of the promises, and that is the challenge that you typically have. And this is the expenditure story that I was talking about. Your expenditure is $90 billion, 90 billion euros, your revenue is 86 billion euros, you have a 4 billion euro deficit that comes up. How do I balance that? And obviously this cannot continue, this will crash out. Interest rates, obviously, given all of this, interest rates actually moved up from 6% in 2014 to about 10% in 2015. And sitting in India, 10% may not look huge, but remember it is huge in the European context where average interest rate is about 2.5–3%. Debt of 317 billion euro, interest rate at 6%, annual interest payment was, if you take that, was about 20 billion euros. And that's about 23% of the government revenue. The government was paying about a quarter of its revenues only in terms of interest payment. Unemployment rate, as I said, has zoomed up in the last 5 years to 27% from 10% in the previous 5-year period. And an astonishing 44% of the Greeks lived or are below the poverty line, found to be below the poverty line in 2014. And on top of all of this, Greece became, as I said earlier, became the first country to default, the developed country to default in 2015. Historically. What are some of the social implications? Because of the opinion, because of the way it has been structured, there have been huge costs in terms of the severe effects of austerity measures and huge political turmoil. And Germany is probably enemy number 1 right now in Greece. As you can read out there, they don't like Merkel, they don't like Chancellor Merkel, and the Frau Merkel get out and all of that. There have been violent demonstrations, as you can see out here, and these are outcomes of the fact that the Greeks who have over the years been benefiting from the social largesse of the economy have had now will have to undergo austerity measures. Nobody likes it, and that's what is kind of creating the political turmoil. As you can see, in February 2012, it was reported that about 20,000 Greeks had been made homeless during the preceding year. Athens, one of the busiest capitals at one point in time in Europe, had about 20% of its shops in the historic city center which were empty. Way forward, what happens? Do we look at a fractured Europe? We don't know. We'll come to that. Greece's total debt of about $485 billion, 340 billion euros. You can see France, Germany, this is how the bank and the private lending people, this is how it spreads out to the other people. France is the largest one, but Germany has a fairly large amount of the exposure that it kind of takes. This is the government's debt. So what happens? Who next? Well, Ireland, Italy, Greece, Spain, Portugal, you don't know. But if Greece is gone, and that is the reason why the European Union has been fighting so hard to maintain it. If Greece goes, who next? And therefore, Greece was small. If Greece goes, nothing happens. Nothing impacts you to that much. But if Italy or Spain gets hit, well, then we're not talking small amounts. We're talking about 1.4, over $1 trillion economies. Greece, as you see, is only a 236 billion economy. Nobody really cares. I mean, at some level, it does not really mathematically add up and match that much. But Italy and Spain can have significant impacts. Sorry, let me just quickly do it. What are the way outs? And let me put it there. Necessarily structural reforms, no questions asked. Rationalization of tax structures. There are some of the islands in Greece do not pay taxes. So you have to kind of cast the tax net wider. You have to make sure people start paying taxes and collect them. And then you curb corruption. Digital currency card has been talked about because that way there's cash economy. Unlike India, Greece is also a significantly large cash economy. So if you take it into a digital currency framework, your corruption can be curbed and all that. Having said that, Greece will still need another bailout. There's no question about that. Greece will not be able to stand on its own and it will need to be helped out. You need another bailout. You need to have a larger European debt conference to kind of rationalize the debt and all that. But none of that will work without the first few ones. And finally, and my final point is that exiting the euro may not be a bad option for Greece. It may be a bad option in terms of the argument of European unity, fractured Europe as opposed to a common Europe and all that. But exiting the euro is not necessarily a bad option because then the only challenge that Greece has about exiting the euro is that there is this, they don't have a currency of their own, so they'll have to immediately print currency, devalue that significantly and get started. But that's create turmoil. But in the longer term, exiting the euro may not be a bad idea, and they can kind of if they can rebuild their systems, if they can kind of put in structural reforms, curb corruption, and then they run the economy, maybe 5-10 years down the line, they can rejoin the euro from a much larger, from a position of much greater strength, and take it forward and then become a successful economy in that one. If they do not do structural reforms, if they do not rationalize their pension plans, if they do not rationalize their social security schemes, if they do not take action on corruption and all that, they will, Greece will very soon become nothing but a failed state because at some point the money will dry out. There is not an infinite amount of money from the lenders available. The lenders will not have the money, and then there will be no way left to recover the problem. The problem can only be recovered, and the problem can be solved. The bailouts and all are only supports that are that you can offer. They would still need to kind of deliver on those promises, and only then can the economy and the country be revived and kind of debt crisis. I can't even say the debt crisis averted anymore because debt crisis is already there, has happened, but the debt crisis overcome. Thank you. So I think we can have a few minutes of Q&A.
Thank you, Professor Basu. Now we'll open up the question and answer round for the next 5-10 minutes or so.
Sure.
So we also have one question already from Senthil Kumar. If we can just go to the chat section.
Yeah, I am. I'm just trying to see where is it. You're talking to the shipping industry, but Greece is a service-oriented economy. Service constitutes 80%. What happened to the service sector? Well, 80%. It does constitute. The shipping industry is. No, I was talking of the shipping industry in the context of the historical basis from where the problem started happening. Subsequently, it become a service sector, service-oriented industry. But at the end of the day, whom do they service? They don't have money to service themselves. They don't have money to service their public utilities. So there's, 80% was there, but it was all kind of going into waste. So there was really nothing happening. The service sector was primarily the tourism sector. So the tourism-driven system. And as long as the euro remains, that was another point I was trying to make. That if you get in your own currency and you can devalue, suddenly your tourism industry can grow, the service sector can grow, because In euro terms, it is suddenly as expensive for an European or for anybody, for example, take an Indian. If you have to pay in euros, it is suddenly very expensive for you to holiday in Greece. But if you pay in drachmas, and if drachma was there, and if drachma is devalued significantly, suddenly it may be actually cheaper. And therefore you might have a lot more of the economy being consumed, a lot more consumption happening, and therefore the fact that this primarily has become service oriented will kind of help in that process. When Greece was breaking all the fiscal limits, why not pull them up, throw them out, cut funding? Why wait till it blows up? That is correct. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Nikhil, to say that the EU should have acted much earlier. I think the EU was kind of under the hesitation, and I think two things happened. When the EU was formed, there was some level of skepticism that existed in terms of Europe has tried doing this common Europe many times, and every time it has led to failures, which include the two world wars. So they did not want to kind of upset the apple cart, as one would say, and kind of not do anything. They should have done it, definitely. Even funding and all, I think the Greeks have became masters at deception. Did manage to take the European Union for a ride for a close to 4-5 years. I mean it's a collective failure of the European community and European community to kind of not address the issue earlier and nip the problem in the bud and not let it come to a state that it has come to today. Swati, what has been done to help Greece? I think a huge amount. Look at the amount of money that has been pumped into Greece, and pretty much good money after bad money. There's no return that has come in. Even today, we would need to put the world economy, and whether it's Europe or the world economy kind of gets hit. The world is putting in a lot more money towards protecting Greece. And in terms of that sense, there might be an argument to say, do I need to spend this amount of money for just 11.1 million people? Is it really worth my effort of spending so much of money for that? It may not be a humanitarian or a very politically correct statement to make, but purely if somebody were to look at numbers, people can ask that question. But that's not the point. The point is there has been enough amount of, it's like this week, the rest of the world it's like I can take a horse to the stream, but I can't make the horse drink. Similarly, the world economy, the world powers can kind of put in money, offer expertise, offer suggestions, but finally the bullet has to be bitten, the action has to be taken on the ground by the Greek government, which it has not, and that is the problem. Will Greece start printing its own money? Well, as long as they get money, as long as they will continue to get money from Eurozone, they will not. If they don't, they will have to. By itself, I don't think they will, because there is a better argument of, there is always the benefit of being in this, because the longer they are in there, what Greece is playing on, to my mind, the way Greece is playing this is, if we fail, Europe fails. And for Germany and France and some of these countries, the idea of Europe failing is a bigger cost than the amount of money that they pay towards keeping Greece in the fold. And the real challenge, as I'm saying, is not Greece. The real challenge is if Greece goes, what stops Italy and Spain tomorrow from crashing out? And if they crash out, then their economies are... Greece is only 2 or 3% of the Eurozone economy. Italy and Spain is not 2 or 3%. They are close to 10 to 12% of the Eurozone economy. And that becomes the biggest challenge. Rajesh, I think Europe will continue to negotiate with Greece. Fundamentally, like anything else, whatever we say, we will have to continue to negotiate. So that is our only solution. We will have to negotiate. But yes, the room for Greece to negotiate and push through concessions is going down by the day, by the minute, as we say. What impact will Indian economy have due to Greece by Greek crisis? Well, as we've been told by our Minister and the Governor of Reserve Bank of India, the impact is limited. But at the same time, you realize we are interlinked with the world economy. Greece will kind of, an impact in Greece will affect the larger Eurozone economy. and therefore we will kind of be impacted. But there probably may not be a very direct impact. The other advantage is that we are not entirely euro driven or not entirely dollar driven. We will have some impact, but not a huge impact. And Greece is not, I mean, Eurozone as a single entity is one of our largest trading partners, but Greece is not a huge trading partner. So therefore, to that extent, the impact may be muted. Sagar is saying if they exit euro, devalue the currency, won't the debt amount go large enough? The revenues, no, but you realize if they just default. I know, so basically what Sagar is saying is that if they print their own money and devalue, their debt amounts go up. But it's basically saying I'm bankrupt, I can't pay. So governments will, I mean the creditors will have to write off a huge part of their loan, because then they'll basically say, okay, give us what you can. So being in euro and getting money, see what is happening today, they're basically saying I'm putting in my, the rest of the people are saying I'm putting in money, use that money first to repay my earlier debt. But if I kind of if I declare bankruptcy and I go out, then that doesn't happen. And that is the advantage that I will typically get of devaluing, if at all. How does digital currency card? Digital currency card does not help Greece to come out of the crisis. Digital currency card helps Greece to kind of reduce one of the problems that has led to the crisis, which is corruption, cash economy. We can take out the cash economy from that, and that is where it is kind of the thing. Greece is falling into trouble. You see, there are, Sukshit has this question about Asian countries. If there is exposure to Greece, yes. And at a broad level, the answer is yes, there is some impact. But, Greece is a small economy, exposures are not that large. So to that extent, it probably will be muted. I am not saying there will be no reaction, but it will not be a reaction as large as if Italy goes or if Spain goes or something like that happens. How does the crisis affect the global financial system? So I think the answer is again the same. That, the global financial system will be exposed to it. I think there will be a lot more reaction, but not really real action, because the total contribution to the world economy is very small, and they will not really, I mean, it'll very soon iron out. And which is why, to some extent, the rest of the world is kind of indifferent to the Greeks. What's the way out for the Greek citizens? Well, get back into working, get back into productivity, stop being a socialist state, which Greece has been for years, and taking and expecting the government will offer everything on a platter, and you don't really have. I mean, the real thing is people don't really value the products that they get, and then that's what I will say for the Greek citizens, Greek people at large, and also be sensible. Just don't be swayed by mob opinion. Don't. We don't know. You are. You have to accept the fact that there are curbs and there are conditions that you will have to accept. Exactly. No, you can, if you can afford it, drive Porsches and all that. But but be realistic is what I'll say. Rajesh, will you advise investors to buy Greece when it's highly undervalued? It depends on what price. Undervaluation is okay, and what is the holding period and what price? It may not be a bad buy, is all I can say, but without any further detail, it's very difficult to comment anything more than that.
Do we have any more questions? We'll keep this open for the next 2 minutes.
How can Italy or Spain be affected? Well, Italy and Spain also have a very similar problem. You see, the debt crisis is not just unique to Greece. There is a debt crisis that is happening or can potentially bloom up in Italy or in Spain. And if Greece is allowed to exit from the Eurozone without the benefit, then Italy may also have an Italian debt crisis, the Spanish debt crisis kind of hits that thing. They will also go out, and then the idea of Europe is gone. That is how Italy or Spain can be affected. Italy and Spain is not going to be affected by Greece per se. They will be affected first by their own actions, and second by the fact that if Greece is allowed to get out of or default and walk out of the Eurozone or the Eurozone system, Italy and Spain will also be interested in doing it, and that is where the Greek economy will be the idea of Europe, that of a common currency and a common market, is lost. That is where the impact is. Well, current austerity measures suggested will help Greece recover. If implemented in all seriousness and sincerity, it will definitely have some benefit. Whether it will entirely help them recover, I don't know. Time will say, but I'm sure it can't get. I mean, if they do it, it can't get worse.
Professor Basu, we would like to thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And this session has been extremely insightful, and we look forward to interacting with you once again soon.
Okay.
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you, guys. Thanks to all of you for taking time out on a Saturday afternoon. Thank you.